Don't look at that envelope. I keep telling myself that even now, 2 years later. But I saw it the moment my son-in-law set it down on the kitchen counter, and something in my chest went cold in a way I still can't fully explain. I had no idea I was standing at the edge of the worst thing that has ever happened to my family. Let me back up. My wife, Carolyn, was 61 years old when she got sick. I want you to understand who she was before I tell you what happened to her, because I don't think you can feel the weight of any of this unless you know the kind of woman she was. Carolyn grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana, the second oldest of 7 children. Her mother worked 2 jobs, and her father worked 3. By the time Carolyn was 12, she could cook a full Sunday dinner, braid 4 heads of hair, and recite the entire book of Psalms from memory. She used to say God gave her a good mind so she wouldn't have to rely on anyone's good heart. She became a registered nurse at 24, worked 32 years at Riverside Regional Medical Center in Newport News, Virginia. She was the kind of nurse who remembered her patients' children's names, the kind who stayed past her shift because she didn't want a scared elderly man to eat his dinner alone. When she retired in 2021, they threw her a party in the hospital courtyard, and people who hadn't worked there in years drove back just to hug her. That was my wife. We met at a church picnic in 1986. I was 28 and she was 23, and she was standing under a pine tree arguing with her cousin about whether potato salad needed mustard. I walked over and said it absolutely did. She looked at me like I had said something personally offensive. We were married 14 months later. We raised 2 kids, our son, who lives in Atlanta now, and our daughter, who lives 20 minutes from us in Hampton. Our daughter is the reason this story starts where it does. She married a man named Philip about 4 years ago. I'll tell you more about Philip in a moment. What I need you to know first is that Carolyn adored her daughter, and she did her very best to adore Philip too, because that's what Carolyn did. She made room for people. Even when something about them made her uneasy, she'd push that feeling aside and find the grace to let them in. I didn't always do the same. Something about Philip bothered me from the beginning, and I told myself I was being a protective father. He was charming in a way that felt like a performance. He laughed too quickly at his own observations. He had strong opinions about money. Not just his money, but everybody's. Carolyn's pension, my retirement accounts, the equity in our house. He'd bring these things up at dinner like they were natural topics, like it was just curiosity. Once, about 6 months after the wedding, he asked me point blank how much I had in my 401(k). I told him I didn't share that kind of information at the dinner table. He laughed and said I was old school. I said I was exactly that. Carolyn told me I was being too hard on him. Maybe I was. I tried. The sickness started in the spring of 2023. At first it looked like fatigue. Carolyn had been tired a lot since retirement. We both had, in the way that happens when you stop moving at a certain speed and your body finally admits how much the years have cost it. But this was different. She started losing hair. Not a little, in clumps. Her hands shook sometimes when she picked up her coffee cup. Her appetite disappeared. She'd sit down at the table, take 3 bites, and then just stare at her plate. She went to her primary care doctor in March. Blood work came back with some abnormalities, but nothing definitive. They thought maybe it was thyroid-related. They adjusted her medication. She didn't improve. By April, she was having numbness in her feet. She told me it felt like walking on sand, like the ground wasn't quite solid. I drove her to the ER one Saturday morning when she nearly fell getting out of bed, and they admitted her for observation. The neurologist on call ran more tests. He mentioned the possibility of peripheral neuropathy. He wasn't sure of the cause. I sat in that hospital room and held her hand and told her she was going to be fine. I believed it mostly. Carolyn was strong. Carolyn had outlasted harder things than this. My daughter came to the hospital every day. She'd bring her mother flowers from the Harris Teeter near her house. The cheap ones in the plastic wrap that Carolyn always said were just as beautiful as the expensive ones. Philip came a few times. He'd stay for 30 or 40 minutes, ask the nurses questions in his confident way, and then check his phone and say he had to get back. Each time he left, he kissed my daughter on the cheek and said, "Make sure your mom gets her rest." There was nothing wrong with any of that. I know that. But there was something about the way he watched Carolyn. Not with worry, with calculation. I can't prove that. It was just something I felt in the room, like a drop in temperature. It was a Thursday evening in early May when everything changed. I had stepped out to get coffee from the vending machine on the second floor. Carolyn was dozing. My daughter had gone to move her car before the parking deck closed the lower level. I was alone in the hallway with a bad cup of coffee and a head full of worry. A woman fell into step beside me. I'd noticed her before. She was one of the floor nurses, a heavy-set woman in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the kind of face that had seen everything and still hadn't gotten used to it. She didn't look at me when she spoke. She kept walking, kept her voice very low. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, "I need you to hear me, and I need you to not react right now." I stopped walking. She didn't. "Keep walking," she said, "please." I kept walking. "There are things showing up in your wife's labs that don't fit any of her diagnoses," she said. "I've been a nurse for 29 years. I've seen one other case like this, and I hope to God I'm wrong about what I'm thinking." She paused. "Who has been bringing her food and drinks outside of hospital meals?" I told her my daughter brought her mother smoothies from home every morning. Carolyn loved them. She said it was the only thing that didn't turn her stomach. The nurse stopped walking then. She turned and looked at me directly for the first time. There was no fear in her eyes, just something steady and terribly serious. "I need you to make sure that stops," she said. "And I need you to speak to the attending physician first thing tomorrow morning and ask them specifically to run a heavy metals panel. Tell them you're requesting it. Don't say why." She walked away before I could ask her anything else. I stood in that hallway for I don't know how long. Maybe 2 minutes, maybe 10. The coffee was cold in my hand and my ears were ringing. And I kept thinking about Carolyn's hair falling out in the brush, about the numbness in her feet, about the way she'd been getting worse steadily since early spring, since right around the time my daughter started bringing her those smoothies every morning. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the chair beside Carolyn's bed and I watched her breathe, and I prayed harder than I've prayed since the night my mother had her stroke in 2004. I prayed I was wrong about what I was starting to think. I prayed the nurse was wrong. I prayed that when the morning came and the labs came back, there would be a simple explanation that had nothing to do with my family. I asked the attending physician for the heavy metals panel first thing in the morning. I told him I'd been reading and I just wanted to rule things out. He looked at me the way doctors look at patients who've been on the internet too long, but he ordered it. The results came back the next afternoon. The attending physician asked me to step into the consultation room. He closed the door. He sat across from me with a folder in his hands, and he said, "Mr. Aldridge, I want to talk to you about your wife's results, and I want you to know we've already contacted the appropriate authorities." Thallium. That's what he said. Thallium poisoning, a heavy metal, historically used in rat poison before the EPA banned residential use in the 1970s, still available in certain industrial and laboratory settings. Accumulates in the body over time, causes hair loss, neurological damage, numbness, organ failure if the exposure continues long enough. Carolyn had been exposed for what the doctor estimated was approximately 4 months. The room tilted. I grabbed the edge of the table. 4 months, I said. At minimum, he said. I asked him how. He said they didn't know yet. He said that was being investigated. I knew. I didn't want to know, but I knew. A detective named Howard Webb came to the hospital that afternoon. He was a quiet man, mid-40s, with a yellow legal pad, and the kind of calm that comes not from being relaxed, but from having learned to control what you let show. We sat in the same consultation room, and he asked me a series of questions in a methodical, unhurried way. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I told him about the smoothies. He wrote that down. He asked me who had access to our home. I thought about that. My daughter had a key. Philip had a key. He wrote that down too. He asked me if I had noticed anything unusual about the smoothies, any change in taste or texture that Carolyn had mentioned. I told him she had said once, back in March, that one of them tasted a little metallic. She'd laughed it off and said maybe she'd gotten a bad batch of protein powder. Detective Webb looked up from his legal pad when I said that. "How often did your son-in-law visit the hospital?" he asked. "A few times a week," I said. "Less often lately." "Did he ever bring your wife anything to eat or drink?" I thought about it. I told him that once, early on, Philip had brought a styrofoam cup of sweet tea from a place Carolyn liked. She'd drunk maybe half of it and said she didn't feel well afterward. We'd chalked it up to the hospital environment, the stress of everything. Detective Webb closed his legal pad. "Mr. Aldridge," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. Do you have any reason to believe anyone would benefit financially from your wife's death?" I sat there for a long time before I answered. Carolyn had a life insurance policy, $250,000. I was the primary beneficiary. Our daughter was the secondary. What I hadn't thought about, what I'd never had reason to think about, was that 3 months earlier, my daughter had mentioned to me that she and Philip were having some financial trouble, that Philip's contracting business had taken on a big commercial job and the client had backed out, that they might be a little tight for a while. I had offered to help. My daughter said they were fine. I told Detective Webb all of it. He left. I went back to Carolyn's room and sat beside her bed, and I couldn't look at my daughter when she came in that evening. I watched her set the smoothie container down on the windowsill. She'd brought one out of habit, and I told her the doctor had said Carolyn needed to stick strictly to hospital meals for now, that they were monitoring her sodium and potassium intake very carefully. My daughter nodded and picked the container back up and took it with her when she'd left. And I sat there, hating myself for what I was beginning to believe. Over the next 2 weeks, Detective Webb and his partner put together what they later described to me as a straightforward evidentiary picture. I'll tell you what they found, because I think you deserve to know all of it. Philip had taken out a personal loan 18 months ago for $140,000 to fund the contracting job. When the client backed out, the business collapsed. He had been hiding the full extent of the debt from my daughter. He had credit cards maxed out, a second loan he'd taken against their joint account, and a balloon payment on their mortgage coming due in December. He had researched thallium on his laptop. The search history showed he'd spent time on chemistry forums and on a site that discussed historical poisoning cases. He'd purchased a small amount of thallium sulfate through an online chemical supplier, using a business account he'd set up under a Shell LLC. It was shipped to a P.O. box he'd opened in early January. He had been adding it to the protein powder he gave my daughter to make Carolyn's smoothies. He told her it was a special blend he'd found that was good for older women's joint health. My daughter had no idea. When Detective Webb told me that part, I actually had to put my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound, because I understood then that my daughter had been used as an instrument of her own mother's poisoning without knowing any of it. They brought him in for questioning on a Tuesday. By Wednesday afternoon, they had enough for an arrest warrant. They picked him up at a job site in Chesapeake. My daughter called me from the police station parking lot. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. She kept saying, "Daddy, I didn't know. Daddy, I didn't know." I told her I knew she didn't. I told her I loved her. I told her to come to the hospital and sit with her mother. She did. She sat beside Carolyn's bed and held her hand and cried quietly while Carolyn slept. And I sat across from her in that room, and I realized that we were both victims of the same man, just in different ways. Carolyn spent another 6 weeks in the hospital. The treatment for thallium poisoning is a compound called Prussian blue. Yes, like the paint pigment. It binds to the thallium and helps your bodies excrete it. It's a slow process. It's not a cure so much as a removal. What the thallium already did, it did. Carolyn's peripheral nervous system sustained damage that will not fully reverse. She walks differently now. Some days her hands still shake. But she's here, and that's everything. Philip was indicted on 2 counts of attempted murder in the first degree, 1 count of conspiracy, and several financial fraud charges related to the insurance policy he had tried to quietly verify the payout structure on. Another detail that came out in the investigation: he had called Carolyn's insurance company in February, identifying himself as a family representative, asking about the claims process. The representative he spoke to flagged the call internally. It became part of the case. He pled not guilty. The trial lasted 9 days. I sat in that courtroom every day. My daughter sat beside me for the first 3 days and then couldn't continue. I stayed. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 40 minutes. They came back guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 38 years. With Virginia's sentencing guidelines, he will not be eligible for parole consideration until he is in his mid-70s. My daughter was not in the courtroom when the sentence was read. I called her on the drive home. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Is it over?" I told her it was. I have thought a lot about how to talk about my daughter's grief. She lost her husband and her marriage, and a version of herself she can't get back. The version that believed she knew the man she was beside. She has been in therapy since the arrest. She is doing better. She is doing the real hard work of rebuilding herself from the inside, and I am prouder of her for that than I can say. There is something I think about almost every day. The nurse who pulled me aside in that hallway, her name was Margaret. I know that now. I went back to the hospital after everything was resolved, and I asked to speak to her. I wanted to thank her properly. I brought flowers, the real kind. She told me she had noticed the pattern in Carolyn's blood work during a routine audit of her chart, which she did for all long-stay patients on her floor. She said something had looked off to her for days before she said anything. She'd prayed about whether to speak up, worried she was overstepping. I asked her what made her finally do it. She said, "Because if I was wrong, you'd just think I was a nosy old woman. And if I was right and I stayed quiet, I'd never forgive myself." I think about that a lot. The courage it takes to say the hard thing, the true thing, when saying nothing is so much easier. Margaret had nothing to gain from getting involved. She was 3 years from retirement. She could have told herself it wasn't her business, that the doctors would figure it out eventually, that she was probably reading too much into routine numbers. She didn't do that. She walked beside me in that hallway and spoke quietly and saved my wife's life. Carolyn knows the whole story now. She insisted on knowing all of it, which surprised no one who has ever met her. We were sitting on the back porch in October, about 8 months after everything, drinking sweet tea and watching the light change on the yard, and she told me she'd been thinking about Margaret. "I need to send her something," she said. I told her I'd already brought flowers. Carolyn gave me the look she's been giving me since 1987, the one that means she appreciates my effort, but I have thoroughly missed the point. "Not flowers," she said. "She kept me alive. I want to do something real." So Carolyn wrote her a letter, 4 pages, handwritten, in the careful cursive she still has, despite everything. I don't know exactly what she said, because that was between the two of them. But Margaret called our house a few days after she received it, and I could hear her crying from across the room. I want to say something to anyone listening who is watching someone they love get sicker and nobody seems to have an answer. I want to say something to anyone who has a feeling, just a feeling, nothing concrete, that something is wrong and they don't know how to name it. Trust it. You are not paranoid. You are not overreacting. If something in your gut is telling you that the situation doesn't add up, that the person you're supposed to trust is not being straight with you, that something in the room has a temperature that doesn't belong there, trust that feeling. Go looking. Ask the uncomfortable questions. Be the person nobody wants to be at the dinner table, because the alternative is unthinkable. I almost lost my wife of 37 years to a man who saw our family as a financial transaction. He sat at my table and ate my food and called me dad, and all the while he was calculating what we were worth to him dead. He looked at the woman who welcomed him into her home, who made room for him in the way that Carolyn makes room for everyone, and he decided she was an obstacle between him and $250,000. That kind of evil doesn't announce itself. It sets the table, it brings sweet tea, it asks about your 401A with a smile. You have to pay attention. Carolyn is gardening again. She started in the spring, just small things at first. Herbs in pots on the back steps, a row of marigolds along the fence. By June, she had taken over the whole back quarter of the yard. She can't kneel the way she used to, so she built herself a raised bed setup with my son's help, wooden frames at waist height, so she can stand and work. Every Saturday morning, she's out there before 8 o'clock with her gloves and her big straw hat that she's had since before our kids were born. I bring her coffee. I sit on the porch steps and watch her, and I thank God. That's the whole story. That's what happened to us. And I hope that by telling it, maybe it does something for somebody. Maybe somebody out there hears this and pays attention to something they've been telling themselves not to worry about. Maybe somebody asks a question they've been afraid to ask. Because here's what I know after all of this. The people who love you will not always be able to protect you. The world doesn't work that way. But if you stay awake, if you stay honest, if you don't let the comfort of not knowing talk you out of what you're seeing with your own eyes, you give yourself a fighting chance. Carolyn knows that better than anyone. And she's still here to prove it.